This video is about what they don't tell you about tonguing and articulation if you're a brass player. Back in the old days, back in the 60s, when I first started learning to play, things have sure changed, because the first few teachers my father approached wouldn't take me on as a student because I was too old. I think I was 10. Not like today when they'll take you at any age. And both teachers said that they wanted to get kids when they were around 5, preschoolers. But that's the way it was way back when. Another thing is, the first book I was introduced to was a great big fat Arbens. And Jean-Baptiste Arbin, if I've got his name right. He was a method guy and a teacher from the 19th century. And the tonguing in that book, what they used to do was, and it said right in the book, either ta-ka-ta, 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 or tu-tu-ku, tu-ku-tu, 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 ta-ka-ta, ta-ka-ta, ta-ka-ta. Not like today, where it's all la-la-ga-ga-boo-boo. And I say la-la-ga-ga-boo-boo because today's across the board baby talk, tonguing and articulation, they're not making the distinction these days between teaching someone to be a soloist and teaching someone to be a background brass player. Now, when I was a kid in high school, it worked like this. Your first chair people were the few people in the band that were taking lessons. And everybody else was not getting lessons, and they were just people who were showing up that day to play in the band, and they would leave their instruments at school and never practice and all of that wonderful stuff. And it's probably like that today. But what we were taught originally was how to be both good soloists and good background brass players. The two things were taught differently in those days. And let me give you an example of why. My first teacher was a fellow named Joe. Now, sorry, Joe, if I'm getting your name wrong, but I was taught to say his last name de Broquier. And I know a lot of people who pronounce his name de Broeker. But Dutch guy, graduated from the Paris Conservatoire, and his tonguing was very percussive. And other guys I'd heard who graduated from the Paris Conservatory also had that very percussive style of tonguing. And if you want to hear that style of tonguing from a non-Paris Conservatoire guy, but from a guy from that era, listen to John Burke's Dizzie Gillespie. There's a riff that he played. If you're familiar with Dizzie Gillespie, you'll know which riff I'm talking about. Very percussive style of playing, and sounded exactly like my old trumpet teacher, Joe de Broquier. Now, Joe as a teacher always taught players sort of a meat and potatoes style of playing. And if you ever became a soloist, he suddenly changed up, and you had to learn X and Y and Z to be a soloist. You play with a bigger sound, you play with bigger articulation and all of that. And I know a lot of teachers these days who don't do that. Another teacher of mine, Ken Hopkins, was the same way. You'd learn just the basics up to a certain point, and if it looked like you were going to really take off as a player, you had to learn how to play as a soloist. And a lot of guys said you have to play with the big sound, and you have to all of a sudden project and learn what volume means. And volume does not mean playing aloud. Volume means filling the room, literally volume. What they meant by volume was not what the average player thinks of as volume. Now, here's the thing about tonguing. There are two distinct and separate types of tonguing, and they depend on whether you're a background brass player, which is most players, or a soloist. Now, when Maurice Andre in the trumpet world started having a big influence on and the non-pressure system started really taking off, the approach toward articulation changed, and everybody was going goo goo da da, just gently interrupt the flow and do goo do do goo do do goo do wah wah, crybaby sound. And that's all very well and good if you're a soloist, but it stinks if you're a sectional player, because if you've got if you're playing in a really big band, a really big concert band, and you got, say, 12 trumpet players or 12 horn players or a dozen trombone players, if you all go goo goo ba ba baby la la, your articulation turns into mush. Mushy, mushy, mushy. Because the more players you've got, the less the articulation cuts through. The more guys you got, the more clear and detached your articulation has to be. Soloists' articulation is one thing. Sectional brass articulation is entirely something else. Now, that doo-doo gaga wah-wah style of playing is it sounds great for solo players, but when you hear sectional symphonic level players too are guilty of this. Instead of having a hair-raising, exciting entry, the whole band will go pwah, pwah. I would dearly love to provide some examples, but I know they'll offend somebody out there, so I'm going to restrain myself. Because these are some of the best, and guys will be saying, "Oh, those are Chicago brass players. Oh, they can do no wrong." Oh, yes, they can. Anyway, food for thought. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and feel free to disagree and set me right. Does that sound like a plan?